what has occurred to this human being that's led them to think that the thing that they did was a logical and reasonable decision and choice of action.
It's about how did you get to where you are, and how did what happened to you impact your choices that you made.
My first thought is like, wow, that's really terrible.
We're learning to manage our emotions. We're learning to understand ourselves, form identities, learn how to relate to other people.
Why did the person do that thing?
If more people can have conversations like this, that the reasons why somebody does something quite terrible and quite horrible is not clear cut.
Welcome to the Authentic Man podcast. I am your host, David Chambers. This is a podcast for men who want more and less from life. More deep connection, more emotional intelligence, more self-awareness, and more great sex. And less heartache, less conflict, less overthinking, and less stress. Creating dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that are incredible and authentic. My deepest goal is that you, the listener, can take away what you hear in this podcast and apply it to your life so that you can experience greater happiness, transformational growth, deeper relationships, and profound sexual intimacy. I believe that as men, we are capable of so much more depth than we are shown or led to believe. So join me as we get deep into this. Welcome back to another episode of the Authentic Man podcast. I'm your host, David Chambers, and I've got a really powerful conversation. It's a really incredible conversation about topics that we find very difficult to talk about. I sit down with my guest, Daniel, and we talk about, people who commit crimes, actually. That's his work, and he'll talk about that when we get into that. People who have committed crimes from murders to sexual assault. So it's also worth giving you a trigger warning that this podcast episode contains some conversations around murder and sexual assault and sexual crimes against children as well. But we talk about how he helps rehabilitate those people. We talk about the role of masculinity in those crimes as well. We talk about trauma, generational trauma, and people's journeys that may impact them in a way that leads them to commit really serious crimes. We talk about the importance of meaning and the importance of us having perspective. There's a lot of conversation we have actually about the importance of empathy and compassion and accountability, not just on people that commit serious crimes, but also on all human beings for us and our own evolution. We talk a little bit about why do men who wouldn't appear in society to have suffered much trauma can commit serious crimes, especially serious sexual crimes. And again, we talk about the influence of masculinity inside of that. And we have a lot of conversation about personality disorders, in particular, some stuff around narcissism and the work that Daniel does around that. And this conversation it's going to open your mind. It's going to really open your mind and how you see criminals, people who commit crimes, or people at risk of committing crimes as well as the general man, the everyday man that you see walking past you in the street. So if you enjoy this conversation, which I know you're going to, please share it with somebody. Share it with someone who this could open their mind, could create some more compassion and empathy for them towards people that commit serious crimes, or even men in general. Because I think this is one of those conversations, you'll hear it and you'll go, shit, I'd never really thought about it that way. I was just sitting in my own perspective and I hadn't been able to stretch that far, which is nothing wrong, but it's also understandable. But without further ado, I'll let you get into the episode. I've got a guest here who, anonymous guest who is a very mysterious man who I've been speaking to on Instagram for a long time. We've done a couple of podcasts together, at least in his podcast.
Yes, you've been a guest on mine.
Yeah, I have been. I'd like to introduce you to the Nice-ish Psychologist.
Well, hello, David. Yeah, as you said, you've been a guest on my podcast before, so I'm actually quite grateful to return the favor. So it's nice to be here. Thanks for the invite. I must admit, the last time we did a podcast together, I think it was with Alex, and actually by this time of the night, the view that I have behind me was like really dark and dreary, and yours was really still sort of like sunlit. So I'm actually quite pleased that both of us are still in sunlight, because it's now going into British summer. So that feels like a win on my part.
We'll see how we go in about an hour.
Yeah, you'll probably still be winning with all the light on your side.
Maybe we'll see.
Maybe
Might
not.
get a nice orange glow. So, I don't know. We've spoken about many different topics, but I'd love to know, what it is you do, and what was your journey to do what you do as well. I always love to hear people's journeys, because sometimes when we get to the work we do, we can almost seem quite mysterious and magical, but often we're just regular human beings.
Well, so firstly, sorry, my name's Dan. For anyone listening, I know I was introduced by my Instagram handle, but I do have a name, so it's Daniel or Dan or whatever. And so I'm a duly qualified clinical and forensic psychologist, and I currently work within forensic / what we might call secure care within the sort of NHS mental health system, and within His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, as it's now known. I was going to say something a bit sarky there, but I shan't. But yes, sorry. So I'm a psychologist, and I work primarily with men and women who we would consider at a high risk of reoffending, particularly around the fact that the individual or the population that I work with would fall under the banner of having what we would ordinarily call, I suppose, personality disorder. And I know personality disorder is a bit of a contentious label, but I guess for the purposes of the service that I work in, it's called the Offender Personality Disorder Pathway, which, as I've kind of said, is a joint venture between NHS England and HMPPS. And I guess the reason it came about, just very briefly, is because I guess historically some individuals who have grown up with, I guess, very fixed views about themselves, the world, other people, that were kind of quite rigid and difficult to change through, I guess, traditional offender rehabilitation programs, were often released, and they sort of tended to reoffend quite quickly. And then I guess through quite a lot of research, it was found that those with, well, I suppose what you'd call quite rigid and fixed personality characteristics, personality traits that kind of shaped how they understood themselves, how they viewed other people, how they kind of viewed the world in general, were more likely to sort of reoffend more quickly, and ended up being either recalled back into prison, or on, the unfortunate occasion would go on to offend further. So I guess all this data was collected, and it was decided that actually, in order to try and reduce reoffending by this particular sort of cohort of individuals, they needed a particular pathway that better understood the links between their history, their past history, their personality profile, the way that was how they understood themselves, how they understood their interactions with other people, how they understood threat, or how they understood going about living their life, and I guess the ways in which they responded to that, and the behaviors that occurred, which would obviously fall under the banner of, I guess, sort of antisocial behavior or offending behavior. And I guess the whole idea was to kind of get a really good comprehensive understanding of that person as an individual, and then try and sort of target their intervention needs around that, which eventually, long story short, became what is called the Offender Personality Disorder Pathway, which is what I work in. So I work in two services. I work in a community service, but I also work in a women's prison as well. The second half of your question was, how did I get to where I am? So that's a long journey that probably traces back to when I was about 13 years old. Very briefly, and as quickly as I can. So I've always been interested in people. I don't know why. I couldn't really tell you the kind of defining point about why I became interested in people, but I've always been interested in people watching and then kind of making up stories in my head about how the couple across from me got together, or what those people over there are having a conversation about, or what that man walking down the street might be thinking about, and what his life's like, and sort of, always a bit interested in how have people come to be where they are, and what's their life story. And then that coupled with a bit of an early morbid fascination with why people do commit crimes and why they offend. And I guess I've always been really fascinated and intrigued by sort of crime/horror fiction, where a police detective will hunt down a serial killer who has a particular methodology of doing things. And then, that was all very interesting. But I guess what I always found more fascinating was that kind of neat tying together at the very end, where kind of it was explained as to why somebody chose particular victims or did something in a particular way. And it was that knitting together of this is the backstory, this is the upbringing that somebody had, and these are the particular things that, created this very sort of, inventive serial killer that you always get in these fictional novels or films and stuff like that. So I'd always been really fascinated by that. And then I was very inspired by the character of Alex Cross in the James Patterson novels. This was back before James Patterson sort of just syndicated out all his books and got several thousand other people to write all his novels. I don't know if you're a James Patterson fan or have ever read a James Patterson novel. No, it's just a little gripe that I have. Anyway, moving on. I was always very fascinated by him as a character, and he was a police detective who was also a forensic psychologist. So he was always key in trying to understand why people did that, and based on profiling and all that kind of stuff would eventually kind of lead him to catch these criminals in the book. So I eventually wanted to become a forensic psychologist in the sense of wanting to kind of serve justice, catch criminals, bring them to justice, I suppose. But then, throughout my journey, so I went on to do a psychology undergrad, then a master's, and then eventually started working within the field of mental health in general psychiatric care. So working with individuals who are sort of sectioned and hospitalized due to their mental health status or due to their mental illness. And I guess I started to develop the more empathic side, which I think I have now, where I started to realize that actually people, aren't the circumstances in which a person grows up in, and the circumstances in which, people experience life kind of, have a very big influence on the decisions that they make, and whether they develop a mental illness or whether they go on to offend, which, we'll get into that kind of stuff later, I'm sure. But I guess overall, it kind of gave me a different idea about what I wanted to do. And eventually I found out that actually being a forensic psychologist isn't about chasing down criminals in the streets, much like the Americanized version. It's actually a lot more about understanding why people commit their crimes. And there's lots of different ways to be a forensic psychologist. So you can be an expert witness in court. You can assess somebody's sort of capacity, and so I guess, what's it called? It's called the the insanity plea in America, but here it's the fitness to stand trial. So you can so sometimes either psychiatrists or psychologists might assess somebody to kind of determine their whether they were mentally ill or whether they had capacity to know what they were doing at the time of committing a crime. So forensic psychologists can do that. But primarily, my understanding is that forensic psychologists will assess somebody, and they will determine what somebody's risk is, and they will think about like a treatment pathway within a prison system that kind of seeks to address the reasons why somebody did what they did. And I guess that's what I learned. But then also in my time working within the forensic system, again, so the stories that I heard, or that you hear and that you learn about somebody's life, just kind of shaped how I now see and understand those who commit crimes, which I can appreciate. If there's anyone listening who maybe thinks that I have a very idealistic notion of all this, I can appreciate that. That's not everyone necessarily has the capacity or willingness to see things from that perspective. And, that's fine. But that's why there's people in the world like me, who have the interest that I do and who can see things from the perspective of somebody else and try and understand why they did what they did. And with the end goal of helping that individual do things differently, and live a different life so that actually they can go on to not reoffend. So that's where I am, and that's how I got to be where I am. And then eventually, so from my master's, I then went on to do a doctorate, which is how I came to be a psychologist.
That was quite a journey from kind of books and TV shows. Do you know what comes to my mind as you were talking at the beginning? I was thinking of Columbo. I don't know if you watched, I've seen a lot of Columbo in my time. My mum used to love watching it when I was a kid. And, Columbo, he's following the guy. He knows the guy. It's always a guy as well in Columbo, isn't it? It's always a guy he's after. And then it comes to the end and he's like, one more question. And he ties it all together. And you're like, wow, man, Columbo, how did he do that? And it's that kind of image that came to me as you were saying that, being that person that stitches it all together and understands it. Columbo was wonderful, but it's it's a bit of Columbo.
It's very fanciful, Columbo is.
Yes. I was hoping so. I can't imagine detectives out there like Columbo in jackets, or like Luther even. I do love a bit of Luther as well.
Yeah.
But it does sound, as you describe what you do, it does sound, for me, it sounds really fascinating. And I think the piece that kind of jumped out to me is a perspective, actually. That's the first thing that you said it towards the end. It's like having that perspective of seeing why people might do things that we would kind of often class as horrible, terrible, like you could read off the names,
Yeah.
But actually being able to kind of see what has occurred to this human being that's led them to think that the thing that they did was a logical and reasonable decision and choice of action. And I guess as a coach, I spend my time a lot in other people's shoes, trying to understand their world, to help them see the gaps and the boundaries of the world and what's outside the boundary of the world. So it's like almost quite second nature to me to almost leap to, I might read something that's really terrible, and after my first thought is like, wow, that's really terrible. I'm like, but why did the person do that thing? Mm-hmm. I guess it's something I say to my clients a lot. I was like, we need to replace judgment with curiosity more often in our lives. Life's gonna be better for you if you replace your judgments with curiosity. Mm-hmm. And it's what really came to me there when you're saying about seeing someone else's perspective. Mm-hmm. But I want to jump to one of the things also I want to, for the clarity of conversation, is when you say personality disorders, mm-hmm. What do you mean by personality disorders? Because we all know, unfortunately, Instagram has found this obsession with narcissism, which I hate deeply, mm-hmm. because, mm-hmm. people seem to declare everyone a narcissist just because they didn't serve them their coffee in the right way. But there's a lot of other personality disorders out there other than narcissism being like 70% of the population.
Yeah. So I guess the easiest way to kind of frame it initially is like, so, how would you describe your partner in terms of her personality? What would you say like stands out to you about her in the way that she is?
She could be really horrible to me sometimes. No, she's kind, she's thoughtful, she's compassionate, she's understanding, she's loving. She's very good at being organized. And she puts up with me and my complexities.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess what you've described there are sort of And I guess, how do you know that she's kind?
Because God, I'm not going to say the first thing that comes to my mind there. Sometimes she'll just do things to me that are really nice. Like, I don't know, if she's seen I've been working till late, she might come in and just be like, I noticed you haven't got any water left, have some water. Or she might say to me, it's late, David, you should stop working now. You know, she's looking out for my welfare and my well-being.
Okay. So that's like observable behavior. So things that she does for you that you can see, that's tangible. And I guess so I guess, why does she do that, do you think? What is it about her that kind of makes her act in that way, in a kind way towards you, other than just being kind?
I think she gets enjoyment and pleasure from it as well.
Okay. Yeah. So there's something about what it gives her, and I guess potentially how she sees you. So there's obviously something about wanting to do something nice for you, and I guess the maybe the pleasure that she sees in how happy that makes you, or being able to give you a rest and things like that. And I guess so based on that, how do you think she sort of sees the world? How do you think she understands the world and her place in it?
I'm definitely not going to let her listen to this podcast episode, but she's going to see the world as she's having a positive impact on the world, and the world is having a positive impact mostly upon her and her life as well.
And so I'm assuming that she probably thinks that the world is also a kind place, and that other people are kind, and that actually the world isn't all bad.
Definitely. She doesn't think the world's all bad. You know, bad things happen.
But and I guess that's kind of what we kind of think about as somebody's personality. So it's their behavior, how they might think about themselves, how they might think about other people, and how they might think about the world. And I guess that's just kind of like one of the sort of basic ways that we understand human beings, is that they are individuals within context that have, that can behave in certain ways, so they can do certain actions, and those actions are generally prompted by certain beliefs that they either have about themselves or they have about other people, and I guess also, the beliefs that they might have about the world around them. And that's pretty much how I've come to understand personality, is that it's and the things that we notice and the things that we see that person do, and the way in which we describe what that person does or how they are what we would call traits. And when we say that a person has personality traits, it's the things that they say, do, how they act, what they believe, which usually stems from this kind of inner world that they have, which is then sort of reciprocated, or how they kind of internalize the external world. And so that's why everyone has a personality. Everyone has a personality. We all have different personalities. But the other thing about that is that personalities are fixed, but they're also fluid. So the way that you act in your home is slightly different to the way that you might act when you're at work, which is slightly different to the way you might act when you're with your friends. So it's contextual, but there is still like, I guess, an authentic personality. So your partner, I'm assuming that she's kind to all people. She's not just kind to you. She's probably kind to her parents, her friends, the people, the clients that she works with. So that's something that we think about as a thread, a personality trait that threads through her, and it kind of makes up who she is. So when we talk about personality disorder, we only ever really talk about personality traits that are, I guess, problematic. So there's 3 P's where we talk about personality traits, and one of the things is that they have to be problematic, because it wouldn't be considered a disorder if it wasn't problematic. If it was just, and we all do, like, we're all a bit angry, we're all a bit cantankerous, we're not always the nicest people. So I'm sure that your partner has moments where she's not the kindest that she probably thinks that she should be, or actually she gets really angry, or she can potentially be rude to some people. We're human beings. We're not the same way all the time. But I guess the idea is that somebody with a personality disorder is that their personality character traits are problematic. So it causes a problem for them. It causes a problem for other people. And I guess within the case of people who are within the forensic population, is that it generally causes a bit of a problem for society in the sense that it probably goes against sort of the social norms of the context that somebody lives in. So the other thing to think about is that personality traits are also quite contextual. So a personality traits that are thought of as normal within a Western culture are probably seen slightly differently in a Eastern culture. So, there's obviously various different ways of being, if you're from the West, and when you go visit an Eastern country, like say sort of China and Japan, they have, and I'm generalizing a bit here, and I apologize, but I guess they're a lot quieter, I guess, than maybe we are, and there's a almost deferential sort of way that they are about themselves, which isn't to say that they are necessarily submissive or they're pushovers or anything like that, but just how they are and how they interact is very distinct and very different, and I guess that's culturally defined in some way. So the personality. So if somebody has a personality disorder, their personality characteristics are outside of the norm and problematic in relation to the culture and the context in which that person exists. So the other thing that it has to be in order for somebody to be considered to have a personality disorder is that their personality traits have to be persistent. So it has to be throughout their lifespan. So somebody can't be diagnosed with a personality disorder, as we understand it in the sort of medical model sense, before the age of 25, because actually people, I think beforehand people used to diagnose somebody with a personality disorder sort of much younger, but actually more recent research has revealed that actually we don't stop developing until we're 25. So actually our brain is going through a lot of change. We're learning to manage our emotions. We're learning to understand ourselves, form identities, learn how to relate to other people right up until the age of 25. So if you think about, the fact that at the age of 18, we're expected as, young adults to leave the house and fend for ourselves. The fact that we don't stop developing until the age of 25 is actually quite ridiculous. That's a whole extra 7 years, where we're still learning about ourselves and our identity, which is, makes a bit of sense as to why when some children, flee the household, they go a bit nuts and crazy and just end up living the sort of student lifestyle. So it makes sense, doesn't it? But I guess in order for somebody to be diagnosed with a problematic personality trait, that has to be present throughout their life. So starting from early age, because if somebody develops a personality pattern that's problematic after the age of 25, it's probably something to consider, but it's probably not necessarily a composite of their personality makeup, because we start to develop a sense of who we are, or start to relate to the world and start to behave in our interactions with the world from a very young age. So I guess it has to be sort of problematic from quite early on. Generally, sort of pre-teens is where we start to maybe think about that, and then if it continues past the age of 25, then it's a bit more of a crystallized personality trait that we can then sort of consider to be, again, disordered in the sense that it might be problematic and cause issues. Then the other thing that it needs to be is that it needs to be pervasive. So kind of like how I said about your partner being kind across all contexts and to all people, people's problematic and persistent personality characteristics have to be across all contexts. So it has to be pervasive. So they have to be the same at work. They have to be the same with their family and all that. So it's not like if somebody's just an arsehole at work, they don't have a personality disorder because they probably just don't like the job that they do, or their boss is a bit of a dick, or, whatever. To say that somebody then has a personality disorder because actually when they're at home, they might be really calm and gentle and kind and, really relaxed because they're not in a shitty work environment that they hate. But if they were that way at work, and then they were that way at home, and then they've been like that through their school years and all that kind of stuff, then you can, in the context of school and college and university and all that kind of stuff, then you can potentially start to think about the fact that somebody has a personality disorder. And I guess to summarize, there are lots of different types of personality disorders. And I think, if we wanted to, we could go through the whole DSM list and the categories and all that kind of stuff. But, people have Google, and it's quite easy to look up all the things. But so I guess, to sort of then come back around to what you were saying about narcissism, I guess what one of the difficulties with social media is that, and I'm actually trying to write some blogs and do my own sort of podcasts about trying to think about the influence of social media and how we try and think about sort of psychological mental health terminology, and I guess what the influence is of that. But I guess what tends to happen is that people will see something on social media, and then they will relate that to their life, how they've perceived someone, and because that fits how they've experienced it, then they start to think that that person then has a personality disorder. And again, so it's also very sort of tenuous territory, because actually some people's experience is that they actually might have been in a relationship who was a narcissist, or somebody who would classify or fall within the category of having like a narcissistic personality disorder. But also it's very possible that they just have somebody who was mean to them because they're not necessarily a nice person. And I guess something that is not always thought about is the fact that relationships are kind of a bit they're relational, isn't it? So there's a bit of a give and a take. And I guess something that sometimes people might struggle with a little bit more is actually thinking about what their, how they have, I guess, what their sort of part in that kind of relational dynamic might be. Which again is not to say that if they get in a relationship with somebody else, then they're going to end up with somebody who acts exactly the same way. It might just be the fact that two people who exist just don't match and they clash, and that it's just a horrible pairing. And actually, if they find somebody else who's a different personality type and they gel together, it'll be a completely different experience. But I guess I think one of the things that has happened, and again, this is not at all sort of backed by research. This is just purely my assessment from my very sort of limited experience on how people internalize messages from social media. But I guess it's just, but I guess the fact is that there's now this information out there, isn't there? And it sometimes helps people make sense of the experiences that they've had, which also may be very true and genuine in the sense that they, if we're talking about people who are narcissistic and potentially abusive and all that kind of stuff, or who have actually been abusive, some people will definitely have been in an abusive relationship. And I'm not trying to negate that at all. I guess at the same time, there are some people who may have just had a really difficult relationship with somebody who, let's be honest, probably wasn't honest or probably wasn't very nice, and who probably may have cheated. But just because somebody's dishonest and just because somebody cheats and just because somebody isn't a very nice person doesn't make them a narcissist, pure and simple, because actually they may be very different in very different contexts, and they might not have been like that all their life. And again, they might be very young. So if anyone is dating and they're under the age of 25 and they are having these very sort of tumultuous relationships, they're both very young. People are not fully formed individuals, up until the age of 25. So yeah. So that was a bit of a tangential answer.
It's a really, really full answer. And it's like, there's so many things in there. You talked about beliefs and actions and how our beliefs influence our actions. And, I'm a coach. So my whole thing is being in helping people surface their beliefs and actions. And I guess I've heard the stat about 25 years old, that our brains don't fully develop until we're 25 years old. We're not able to like reason and cognitively understand things properly until we're 25 years old. And it kind of blows my mind, because we have to make so many serious decisions about life from 16 years old,
age, yeah.
16 GCSEs, A levels, go to university, choose a job. People get married and have children. People have like 3-4 children before they're 24 years old, and they really are still kind of grow into a human being. And I guess kind of made me think, it's like why, say, midlife crises, or what I like to call them midlife awakenings, are so common because you make all these decisions up to 25 and then you just keep making those same decisions. And there comes a point where you're like, wait a minute, I've just lived the same life for 10, 15 years and I haven't really thought about it because your brain wasn't really there. But I think the thing that was most interesting to me is this concept you talked about here, where we hear like something like narcissism, narcissists, they're narcissist hunters on Instagram. They're everywhere. They're always looking for narcissists. And they don't always take responsibility for their part, because obviously there are narcissists in the world and there are people that are mean and horrible and so forth in relationship. But I do find it very interesting that people are very quick to say that person made all these things happen in this relationship and I have no responsibility there. And I think why that's interesting to me is because, as a coach and I work with people in their relationships, I've seen it in couples. I've seen them in front of me before. They're like, I talk to them, because me and my partner also, we do couples coaching. So we work with a couple and we speak to them individually, then together. So they'll tell you, this is what my partner does and this is how it affects me and this da-da-da-da-da. And then you hear the other one, they go, this is what they do and this is how they make that happen. And then you see the two of them in front of each other, and as a third party witness to it, it becomes like a scene in a play, almost like you're watching it and you're like, the story that you've both told me, you've omitted your part in this story, or how you make this thing happen, how you react to them that creates this thing. And I think as human beings, often, I guess this is self-awareness, isn't it? This is the difficulty of being aware of self, of being able to be aware of ourselves and how being ourselves is affecting a relationship and a situation. But it is that piece that everyone's kind of looking on narcissist watch, always looking for that narcissist. Where are they? I can find them. They're over there. I see him. He's behind the bush.
And I guess, in terms of the population that I work with and the individuals that have these sort of very strong personality character traits, part of the work that I do is about helping them understand where they've got to in their life. And I guess, the decisions that they made. And I guess the important thing to highlight is that, the work that I do isn't about sort of absolving people of their actions, because that's very important, because the things that these people do have consequences, and there are very often victims, families that are affected by this, by the actions that they perpetrate. And it's a both and thing. It's about how did you get to where you are, but also, and how did what happened to you impact your choices that you made? And how can we take what we've learned about you and help you to learn to make different choices, so that there are different consequences and that there are less harmful consequences to other people. So I guess it's a bit like what you were saying about how people aren't necessarily always aware of their own, the part that they play in situations, because very often what we often see is the consequence of an interaction. And if it's not favorable for us, then we often attribute that to somebody else having done something wrong, and we're not always able to acknowledge or recognize or know that we have then done something in relation to that. I think, even me as a psychologist, with all this knowledge that I have about interactions, cognitions, way people think, perceptions of the world, even I have my own blind spots where, my partner and I will have disagreements and we'll have conflicts, and I'm like, no, but that's what you've done. And, she will say, well, yeah, but that's because you did this. And I'll be like, oh, yeah, okay. I wasn't aware of, I had my blinkers on. I was tired. My sort of my prefrontal cortex thinking brain wasn't turned on at that particular time, and all that kind of stuff. So we're all fallible to this notion of living with a certain lack of conscious awareness about our own influence in things. What am I trying to say? Oh yes. So I guess part and parcel of the work that I do, it's very complex and it's very multi-layered, and it's not as black and white and as simple as what I'm painting it to be. But I guess one of the things is about trying to help people create an awareness of what they've done, why they've done it, what the sort of the consequences of their choices, and how to kind of learn to make different ones, really.
It seems like it's what everyone needs, So everyone needs a bit more perspective, understanding of how they're being and how that affects the world. And so the popular, because you often use the word population and that you work with, and I know from your work on what you've spoken about on Instagram that there's some experience of how men have affected the world, and particularly women, that's really landed for you in many ways. So I'm interested in what are the sorts of crimes that the population that you interact with commit or have committed or are at risk of committing.
So I guess the population that I work with is people who have personality disorders. So that's kind of like, so I don't work exclusively with, murderers, or I don't exclusively work with people who have committed sexual assaults or sexual violence. And I don't exclusively, so my kind of, the cohort of individuals that I work with sort of are people who have, again, as like I say, sort of would fall under the remit of meeting a personality disorder diagnosis. So because of that, I actually work with people who have committed quite a vast range of offences. So, I have worked with people who have taken lives. I have worked with people who have committed sexual violence. I have worked with, and, I say have, and I do, I've worked with people who have committed acts of violence against children. I have, and I guess for me, it's less about, I'm just going to be very cautious about how I say this, because it's not to take away from the impact of what somebody did, because as I say, my role is always about public protection. The reason why I do my job is to make sure that somebody doesn't go out and do the same thing again or worse to somebody else. So that is my main aim, and that is the point of why I do what I do. But the stance that I take is about trying to understand how somebody got to doing that so that they don't do that again. So when I say that because what I was about to say is that for me, it's less about the type of crime that they committed and more about the circumstances and the life journey that that person had that led them to commit the crime. So again, so it's not about diminishing the crimes, but actually because actually there are offenses that really hit you hard, and there are people that you work with that have done some things that you kind of have to sometimes sit back and go, okay, holy shit, that's actually quite intense. And that's why we get supervision. So I have clinical supervision. So these are things that I process with my supervisor, and we talk about it. And it's the opportunity for me to process and think about the impact of particular offenses and crimes that have been committed. And it allows me the opportunity to not, because I guess what's important is for me to not let my judgments about what has happened impact on how I work with an individual. Because if that starts to happen, then that might then influence the sort of my empathic capacity towards somebody, would impact the necessity to kind of hold unconditional positive regard for the person. Because I guess sort of even in the job that I do and with the people that I work with, having the capacity to hold hope for somebody that they might be able to live a different life is important. Because, if I don't believe that somebody can maybe achieve a different life, then it's not going to come out in my work. I'm not going to be fully invested in it. It's going to, it'll leak out in how I work with the person and how I interact with the person. So actually, it's very important for me to take and process the difficulties that come up, both with the offences, but also with the histories that the people bring. So you mentioned about sort of my Instagram page and kind of the view that I have about thinking about men and women and the impact of men's actions on the experiences of women. And I guess the reason why I have that is because I work with women as well. So I work in a women's prison, and actually quite a lot of, not all, but quite a lot of the experiences that they've had growing up and developing and I guess getting to the point where they were in their life was actually sort of, shaped by some pretty horrible experiences as a consequence of their interactions with some pretty nasty men in their life. And also, again, the men that I work with as well, their life stories and their life trajectories of neglect and abuse and just not being valued or having a lot of world pressure placed on them from a very young age. It's all quite emotionally, what's the word I'm looking for? Overwhelming at times. So it's important for me to take that and to get supervision about it, so that doesn't impact on the work that I do. And the reason why I started talking about supervision was because, so I was saying, it's so the population that I work with, it's about their well-being, but it's also about making sure that they don't commit those offences again. But it's the reason I work with them is not necessarily because of the type of offence that they've committed. Well, it is partially because obviously the individuals I work with are considered at high risk of reoffending, and therefore if they did reoffend, the offences that they may then commit afterwards would be quite significant, and the harm would be quite great. So it is about the offence, but it's not necessarily like I don't particularly work with so somebody who's committed murders, or I don't necessarily work with people who have committed sexual offences, if that makes sense.
There's just, you work with people who, the population includes those people. So you come across those sorts of people. I always find myself struggling sometimes for the terms, because people just sound so generic. And, I think one of my friends runs a care home and he calls them service providers, the people that are in the care home. But like I can't obviously fully understand the difficulty of going through those, talking to people about those sorts of crimes that either they have been on the receiving end of or have committed, because it's like, they're really emotional things, like you've talked about like murder and sexual assault and sexual assault against children. It's like the stuff that for most human beings, when they hear about that stuff, it really, I don't even think of the word, it really gets them to their core, at the point that, many people won't watch TV programs that contain murder or rape or sexual assault, and they just want to stay away from it. So to be in that day in, day out, not necessarily day in, day out, but in and around, the supervision is so important to kind of unpack that and almost release that from you and your own judgments and your own emotional attachments to it, and to have a space to talk about that, because it's so important to do that, because otherwise you just soak it all in and you hold it in, and it becomes, it clouds your judgment and your ability to do your job well.
Yeah.
And I guess the thing that's really lands to me out of what you're saying is, like, as much as people have done the things they've done, there are, how do I put this? There is a journey, and there are reasons, and there are things that happened along their life journey that cause them to get into certain situations and think in a certain way about themselves, other people in the world around them, that lead them to do these acts. And that almost in itself, not even almost, it actually deserves a level of empathy and compassion, It's kind of
Yeah.
what I'm getting from what you're saying.
Yeah, and I guess so the conversation around empathy and compassion for people who have done really horrible things is a very tenuous line to walk, because I guess what you always need to hold in mind is that for every person that's done a bad thing, there is somebody who's been on the receiving end of that bad thing. And the thing about compassion and care is trying to think about whose responsibility is it, or who should hold compassion and care and empathy for the person who's done the bad thing. And I think the challenge in talking about this is that some people will say that the individuals that I work with, or the population that I work with, probably don't deserve compassion, care, and empathy because, as you say, they've committed, as you highlighted, that they've done things that kind of really sort of hit the deep core of kind of morality. Goes against people's morals and society's morals. The fact that they're in jail is because they've obviously transgressed the laws that we've all sort of signed up to agree not to do as part of human beings in a particular society. And I guess the way that I always think about it is that it's not necessarily the responsibility or the job, I suppose, for lack of a better phrase, of the victim or the sort of those people to do that, because why would you expect them to do that? That would be really unfair to kind of say, look at this person and think about their life when actually they've perpetrated something really horrible against a person, or maybe they've taken the life of a family member. If somebody can come to that place by themselves and can be willing to hear it, there's a whole sort of restorative justice idea where actually, people who have committed crimes will often have the opportunity to kind of meet with the people who have been impacted by their crime, to kind of learn about what the consequences are and to meet people face to face. There's a really, really good podcast called The Punch. I think it's a BBC podcast where it's about a young man who killed somebody with it was a one-punch kill. Have you heard of a one-punch kill? Yeah, so it's when people get into bar fights and brawls and stuff, and they kind of just hit somebody, and then they kind of fall back and they, I don't know, either clunk their head or they hit somebody really hard in a particular part of their brain, and they lose their life. And this podcast is about a young man who did that. He got into a fight, and he ended up killing somebody by just punching them once. And it's a journey about restorative justice, and it's a journey about this man. I can't quite remember how he ends up making contact with the parents of the person that he ended up killing. I think it was through like a restorative justice program which exists in some prisons. And I think so there's a process, and I'm not massively familiar with it, and it is something that I've been thinking about sort of discussing and looking into for my own sort of podcast and stuff like that. But if anybody is listening, wants to go and listen to it, it's actually really powerful, because this young man ends up being quite really close to the parents of the person whose life he took. And it's actually a really, because I guess what he then learns about is the impact of why he did what he did, but then they also learn about his remorse and why, and the type of person that he is, and that he's not actually a violent person. Like, he wasn't I think he was a bit sort of, tended to get in fights, but I guess there was something about his upbringing and which shaped the way in which he reacted and did things, and over time the three of them, so the perpetrator and then the parents, come to an understanding of the impact of the action, but then also the life story behind the person that did it, and they actually form quite a close bond. It's a really, really powerful podcast to listen to, which is something that would be really helpful for some people, but actually that's not necessarily going to be helpful for some individuals. Some individuals, quite rightly in their own mind, how they envision justice and how they perceive justice being meted out is that somebody spends their life in prison, or that they be sentenced and go to prison and all that kind of stuff. So when we talk about compassion and empathy for people who have committed, quite serious crimes, the victims and the people impacted by the crime aren't the ones that we should think about holding that compassion. Who should we think who is probably best suited? So individuals like myself, people who work in the prison system, people who work with those in secure care. That's probably helpful for them to hold that. And I think potentially to a wider degree, I think maybe it would be really helpful which is why, I agreed to do this podcast, because I think, if more people can have conversations like this that we're having about trying to understand that that the reasons why somebody does something quite terrible and quite horrible is not clear cut. It's not just that somebody is an evil person. One way to try and think about this, or one way to frame it, is when people talk about racism and people talk about racist individuals. There's quite often there's quite a powerful image. I can't remember, but there's like a white baby and is like being born, and there's like a powerful statement that says no child is born racist, which is true, because when you're born, you have no preconceptions of the world. You come to understand the world through your socialization and the people around you. And, so if a child does grow up to be racist, it's because he's learned the scripts about race, and he's learned the scripts that people who have a different skin color to me are different, and that they are lesser, and because of the skin color I have, I am more superior, and, all that kind of stuff. So, and a similar principle applies to people who commit crimes, is that no one's born a criminal. Life shapes somebody to do what they do. We're not born, well, some people would argue that we are born to be aggressive, and that we are born to be violent, and that we are born to dominate. There are a subset of individuals in the world who believe that. I am not one of those people. I believe that we are, again, I mentioned it earlier before we started this, there's a book called Humankind, which is a wonderful book to kind of reestablish your faith in humanity. So if anybody listening wants to read Humankind by Rutger Bregman, I think his name is, go read that. It's just a beautiful book about how actually the whole idea of us having this sort of dark internal struggle with a violent, instinctual, violent, natural self, and all we're sort of doing is putting a veneer of civility over that is actually flipped. And actually we all seek connection, we all seek love, we all seek validation and belonging, and that's actually our true sort of purpose. The reason why we commit crimes and why we do horrible things is because that gets interrupted, and there's a whole history about how we've come to where we are. It's a really good book, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's my belief that people aren't born evil, or people aren't born monsters, and people aren't born to commit crimes. They are shaped, and some people, and I guess there is a bit of a biological component into some degree, that some people, through their own sort of biological and genetic lineage, may have a propensity for more impulsive behavior. They might have a propensity for being more energetic or more lively, which, again, depending on how that person is socialized, and whether that kind of liveliness and impulsivity is kind of shaped and honed into a more productive and pro-social way, or whether that's kind of shaped into a more antisocial and sort of aggressive manner. That's kind of how people, in a nutshell, will go on to do what they do. And again, I mentioned about the difficult journeys and stories and traumas that people have experienced. Not everyone who has experienced trauma will go on to become a violent individual, or will go on to perpetrate some kind of criminality. So trauma is not trauma in and of itself is not necessarily what am I trying to say? So trauma is in and of itself is not necessarily the answer as to why somebody goes on to do horrible things, but actually it is something that is quite universal through sort of like, and certainly in my experience, and certainly in sort of like a growing body of literature, sort of people's experiences of growing up in adversity is certainly something that shapes people's decisions and reactions to then sort of engaging in offending behavior. That, and then I guess the society and the environment that somebody grows up in, socioeconomic influences, I guess, in working with men, there is an aspect of masculinity that kind of comes into it in some respects. I've worked with some men where they now, in sort of their kind of, at the stage that they're at in terms of trying to turn their life around, I've had, conversations with men about trying to think about, they used to do X, Y, Z because that's what a man does, and this is how you go and do it. But actually now they're like, actually, that's not purely what men do, or if that's what I want to do, then I can go about doing it in a different way. So there's a whole raft of things that go into it. It's a melting pot of ingredients that go into sort of leading somebody down a path of criminality and offending that isn't just as simple as people are bad, people are awful, people are monsters. And again, it's not my place to say that somebody can't hold that view of them if that's how they view somebody who's done something bad, or how they hold the view of somebody of something bad done to them. Then that's absolutely, their prerogative, and I'm not here to say that it's right or wrong, but I guess it's the idea that people do bad things not because they are evil, but because there is a very complex, multi-layered reason as to why.
Wow. You've answered about 4 of the questions I had here.
Did I?
All in one go.
I feel like that was like 20 minutes of speaking.
But I think there's a couple of things in there that really kind of like stood out. You talked about unconditional positive regard, and it's why that jumped out to me is like, it's one of the parts of coaching when I did my coaching qualification that we're told about, is holding our clients in unconditional positive regard, because for a lot of people, they've never had that experience in their lives, right? From some of the people, the population you're talking about, they may have never had anyone in their life hold them in unconditional positive regard. And that in itself can be a transformational, something transformational for them. And, you're talking about empathy and compassion. And I'm like a big proponent of empathy and compassion. I think that it's like, man, this might seem cliche, but I feel like empathy and compassion can fucking heal the world. Like, if we can grow our levels of empathy and compassion for ourselves and other people as well, like, we'd completely start making different decisions about how we organize our world and so forth. But what I also say to people very often is, having empathy and compassion for someone doesn't mean you can't also have accountability.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. I was just about to say that. I was about to say there's a third component, which again is very, very important in the work that I do. And sorry, yes, I'll let you finish, but yeah.
Yeah. And accountability is so important there because, and we practice this in our relationship even. I kind of bring things back to relationship often. It's because, sometimes something will happen and I'm like, okay, I'm going to be, compassionate, understanding, but I'm also going to hold you to being accountable to being better next time, or not doing that thing, or having you fully understand the impact of how that was on me, or vice versa. And I think it's such an important thing, because often we think of compassion and empathy, and somehow we kind of think it's this, oh, I understand, that's okay, that's not your fault. Like, it isn't this kind of soft, do whatever the fuck you like type of thing. It's also like, yeah, I get it. I understand the history and what caused you to do that thing, but do you understand that this is the impact of the thing you did? And how can do you see how you can be better as well moving forward? And I love what you said. You're talking about the book, Humankind. Like, at our core, because this, again, it sounds super woo-woo, doesn't it? Like, at our core, we are love, we are kindness, we are connection. But like, you know, I've got a little nephew, and I know you've got little kids as well. It's like, and my little nephew's like 3 years old now, right? And if you put him anywhere, like anywhere you take him, you take him to a playground, you take him to a supermarket, and all he wants to do is be curious and connect with the people around him. You know, he'll go up to random people and start talking to them and give them stuff and stuff like that. Like, this is his innate nature. You know, it's almost something I said to one of my sisters. I was like, it's really sad. She goes, what do you mean? I was like, because from this point onwards, it's downhill for him. You know, he's only going to become more of an asshole through life, and it's not necessarily his fault. It's just going to be kind of what happens.
It's the moment in his life where he can be curious and seek connection in a way that isn't judged in the way that it is judged. You know, but you know, by any standards, you know, we're a lot more of an isolative society, particularly here in the West, where we sort of we're slightly less concerned about our neighbors' well-being and more focused on our own sort of well-being and stuff like that. And yeah, I know, I agree. Sort of, you know, the older he gets, the more he'll get the messages of, you know, that's not appropriate, or that's not how you do things, and, you know, reel it in, or you're a big boy now, or you're a big child now, we don't do that anymore. And he'll slowly but surely have that. Which is, you know, comes back to what you were talking about. So, you know, when we talk about why somebody develops a personality disorder and why somebody may choose to engage in offending behavior, it comes down to sort of, you know, and I'd like to start by saying that this doesn't necessarily apply to everyone, but just the people that I work with and the population that I work with. You know, we talk about sort of childhood needs not being met. And, you know, that can be in the context of the home life, and it more than often is not, but that can also be in the context of, you know, how society views people. So, you know, I work with a fair few, but not as big of a cohort of people who are sort of from Black and Asian and other sort of marginalized minority groups. And, you know, a big message that they've received from for them is that actually you're other, or you're different based on the color of your skin. And actually, you know, that has an impact on how you know, whilst that's not a childhood need that hasn't been met by the family environment, that's a need of human connection and acceptance that's not being met by the society at large in which somebody grows up in. So actually, sometimes it makes quite a lot of sense, in the sense that if somebody doesn't feel valued and loved by the sort of family that they're in or the culture that they grow up in, why would you expect somebody to have regard for the rules of the society that they grow up in? Because actually, if you view me as bad, and you view me as other, and you view me as less than or not worthy of love or care and affection, I'm not necessarily inclined to give that back. People don't necessarily have a reason to reciprocate that. And again, I just want to make sure that people understand that I'm not justifying why people do what they do, and I'm never justifying criminal actions, because again, like I said, there are lots of people who do go through similar experiences and actually don't end up going down a criminal route. So there is actually something very particular for these people, and you can't always necessarily pinpoint what it is, but it is quite often around sort of socioeconomic status, negative peer influences, growing up with other people, role models who are also involved in criminality, being involved in sort of substance use, which then tends to lead to acquisitive crimes in order to fund drug habits. And it's sometimes about growing up in, maybe violent neighborhoods, or growing up with violent peers where aggression and violence is celebrated, and the more aggressive and violent you are, the higher your status within that sort of peer group is. There are a lot of factors that go into defining how somebody goes from being a person who experiences trauma to then grows up to then commit crimes. It's not just the trauma, but I guess the key message is that if you don't treat somebody as an individual that has purpose, meaning, and a place within society, you can't necessarily expect that person is going to feel like they belong, and you can't necessarily expect that person is just going to go along with the social norms, because for them the social norms apply to everyone else that you treat in a particular way. They don't necessarily apply to me, because actually you're treating me as if I'm already bad and if I'm already horrible. And I guess, so from the sort of more personal micro ecosystems that people grow up in, to also the more sort of ecological macro systems that people exist in terms of their societies and their cultures, these individuals are fed this message of, you're not important, you're not worthy. They grow up in states of fear where quite often they have to be scary and be scarier than the person who made them feel unsafe. So yeah, that started off as a question, and I can't remember what it is, but yeah.
Yeah, but it kind of made me think of is like, it's really something I've been talking to my partner a lot about. My partner, she's white, she's Swedish. So we've been going on this kind of whole race journey, I can call it a race journey for the last 2 years. And I was also on a retreat recently, and it was mostly, actually, it was like 60 men, and I'd say, other than me, 2 Asian guys. Everyone else was white.
Yeah.
And there was a moment where the teacher, he talked a lot about kind of karmic work, and he talked it in all the generational stuff. And I kind of said, I was like, I sit here and I come from a long line of fatherlessness through my family on both sides, from my mum's side and my dad's side. My dad doesn't really know how to be a father. He's an absent, emotionally, deeply absent man. And his dad was worse than he is, right? My mum never met her father. My grandma won't talk about him. My mum was left in Jamaica when she was probably about 3 years old, and didn't meet her mum again until she was 18.
Okay.
And just like, sometimes I sit and I'm like, man, like all this stuff that come before me, there's nothing to do with me, nothing to do with my birth. And then I'm born into, the UK, in a country in the 90s, and I always feel that in the 90s, there's a very clear message in the UK of black men are dangerous. They are dangerous. Be careful, because they're dangerous. It was you're on Crime Watch and all sorts. And there's an irony, because I actually did like some reenactment filming for Crime Watch once. And then you kind of look at the kids that grew up out of these systems, and then you can even tag on slavery and the persecution of African countries and Caribbean countries, and then you see the kids and the boys and the men and the crimes that they're committing, and it's very easy just to go, oh well, it's happening because they're black, right? Because on the surface it looks like that, right? On the very simple veneer, that's what it is. But what I'm gathering from what you're saying and what I've learned is like, But actually, when you take all the layers that go backwards, the journey of their life, the constant othering of being in society and being told that you're bad and you're wrong, being in maybe parts of the country where they needed to be scarier than the people around them, or they didn't survive, or they didn't feel safe, or to feel belonging in a society where they didn't feel belonging. They had to join a gang or something like that.
Yeah.
When you pile all that stuff on and you put them out into the world to be men, it's almost like you look and go, man, this guy hardly had a chance, Like
Exactly.
obviously
And
there's a lot else, because as you said, like, you can experience all this trauma and you can make this different decisions. But when you kind of lump all that together, you're like, wow, this person or these people of almost like the game is stacked against them from the day they came out of the womb.
Yeah. Exactly. And, it's when you frame it like that, it's like almost like, well, holy shit, like, what do you expect? Like, how else do you expect somebody to react to the world? Because, everything we do is a reaction to the world. It's a reaction to, our internal world is a reaction to our internal world is an internalization of the external world, and and that reciprocal sort of, feedback loop. So if somebody's continuously internalized the messages from the outside of being bad and different and other and dangerous and, a black dangerous man, or if we think about class, if we think about somebody that's poor and comes from a socioeconomically deprived place, and there's the prejudice and the discrimination that surrounds that, and people come from a particular part of the country or a particular sort of part of a city or whatever, like whatever the sort of the layers are. Sometimes you can just you turn around and you just go, well, it just makes perfect sense that you did what you did. And I guess that's my job. It's to say, so this happened in your life, and this happened in your life, and this is part of your historical makeup, and this is what your sort of family life was like, and this was what your schooling was like, and this is how you were treated by your peers, and this is what you felt you needed to do in order to survive, and this is what you needed to do, and this is how you've got to where you are. And I guess sort of I want to really circle back around to the accountability part of what you were talking about, because it is, when I talk about helping people make decisions to live a life differently, that's what it is. It's about the accountability. It's about, so everything that happened, and therefore it makes complete sense that you are where you are. But now that you know where you are and how you got here, what are we going to do in order to do things differently? How are you going to help yourself? How are you going to learn things differently? What are you going to, and again, so these are very open-ended questions, and they're not, that's not what I sit down and I talk to myself, the people that I work with. But that's like the key. That's like it's kind of the main crux, isn't it? So it's like, so here you are. And, for many people, it culminated in potentially one of the most harmful things that can happen to somebody else. And, they have potentially perpetrated something, very significant. So, it was, if we're talking about crisis points and we're talking about the accumulation of the perfect storm of all these things resulting in having a very detrimental end, this is about as bad as it gets. You know what I mean? So it's about saying, okay, so that's what got you to why you did what you did, but how are we going to move forward? How are we going to take what we know about you, and how are we going to change that? How are we going to help you understand yourself? How are we going to help you understand how you see other people? How are we going to help you understand how you see the world? People, these individuals often have a very low sense of self-worth, and oftentimes shrouded in bravado or shrouded in a suppression of who they are and all that kind of stuff. People will often sometimes people will not often talk about being vulnerable or being frightened and scared, because actually when you're in prison, to even in both, men's and women's prisons, to be vulnerable and to be weak is not good. It's not ideal. You are fodder for somebody else who's going to take advantage of you in that respect. But often these are very And again, I can understand that somebody might listen to this and be like, "Oh God, that doesn't fit." But these are individuals who are often very vulnerable. They have low as I said, low self-esteem, low sense of self-worth, low regard for themselves. Think everybody is out to get them, or very mistrusting, or very dependent on other people in order to do what needs to be done. And they generally just view the world as a bit of a shit place. That's, where, like you were saying, the odds are stacked against them. So, part of my job and part of working with these individuals who have these fixed and rigid views about themselves, others, and the world, it's about trying to change that. And hopefully by trying to change that and giving them skills to kind of, manage their emotions, approach interpersonal relations, so, interactions with other people in a different way, give them vocational skills, give them sort of give them meaning and purpose. So identifying a goal that they can work towards that aligns with their values, so trying to understand what it was that they were trying to achieve whilst they were offending. What was that? What's important to them? Because that's what they were essentially trying to do, is to achieve those feelings of connection, belonging, in some shape or form, living a life that's worth living in some shape or form, the best that they knew how. So then it's trying to sort of find out, like, so what's underneath that? What's underneath your offending? What were you trying to get? And how can we help you achieve that in a way that is less harmful to both others and also less consequential for yourself? And I guess that's what the accountability is. It's not saying, again, so, I often sort of use the example of how you work with children, and that's not to infantilize anybody that's sort of in the prison system or anyone that I work with. I'm not saying that they're children, but it's a really helpful way to conceptualize that. Actually, when you were talking about empathy and compassion, empathy and compassion with children only goes so far. If you've got a child that has got a fork and it's trying to stick it in the plug socket, saying, "Oh, you want to explore and you're wanting to learn about the world and you've got an interest in electricity and you might want to be a future electrician," that only goes so far, right? Like, being compassionate and being understanding of that child who has a metal fork and is going for a plug only goes so far. What you actually have to do is go, "Whoa, no, that's not the right thing to do. That's dangerous, or that's not helpful, or that will have bad consequences for you." So it's about, boundaries and accountability, and saying, "Okay, I can see that you're interested and I can see that you're exploring, but actually let's not stick some forks in the plug socket, because that could end up really, not good for anyone involved." And so it's about, so you're quite right. So compassion and empathy is key, but boundaries and accountability and helping people understand why they did what they did and how to then do something different. So is really important.
Yeah. Wow. It's such a complex, I was gonna say a complex soup, but like there's just so much going on. And I think it's interesting as you just describe. It's like, because it brings a lot of what you're saying you're doing. It's obviously it's not to the level, right? Because you're dealing with people who have really had very, very difficult circumstances. And as a coach, I deal with very regular people who have, what relatively for them is difficult things are happening, right? And I'm having the same kind of conversation often. It's like, well, what was your intention here? What were you trying to make happen? And they're like, "Oh, I was trying to I was on a date and I was interested. I wanted to get to know them." Okay, what was getting in the way of that? "Oh, I was feeling really nervous and really afraid and really, concerned of judgment." Okay, cool. What was that about? Because we're trying to get to the root of what's happening and what do you want and how can you actually get there? Like, if you put aside some of these thoughts and feelings you're having, which aren't attached to anything to this point in reality and all to do with the past. And it's that accountability that really can help us change and move forward. It's almost like I'd rephrase what I said. What can really change the world is empathy, compassion, and accountability. That's the thing that's what really transform the world.
Yeah.
And I guess my mind goes to, and I know you do often talk about this in your content, is like, and I think maybe this is something that's going to be hard for people, maybe hard, is like we see men do bad things in the world, right? Particularly privileged men, right? In particular. And, you hear the stories of like sexual assault and rape and all sorts of things like this, right? Even I've heard this from women I've dated and partners and stuff like that. And the words I'm always being like is like, what's their reason then? Like, is it that they've suffered some of these kind of complex traumas? They're having this so low self-worth. They exist in this bravado. They have a low self-regard for themselves. They think the world doesn't see them well. But because of they exist in a certain level of what we kind of often see as privilege and financial privilege, we assume that they don't have these problems, but they're able to master them so well, and they're kind of still causing these acts? Or is it more kind of complex, insidious evil than that, do you think?
So, I don't know. So, like, to apply what I've said to like a broad stroke sort of, one sort of half of the population is not an easy thing to do, because I think even within the population of men, you have different levels of intersections about, where people sit at and how they might see themselves and how they might interact with the world and things like that. But I guess I might answer your question in this way, but I guess part of what I do and part of what I try to talk about in my account is threefold, really. Is one, that I try acknowledge that men have difficulties and that men deserve compassion and care. The other is that I think the other thing that I try and do is raise awareness about how, whilst at the same time, men still do horrible things, and it's not necessarily that it's the men who are suffering that are doing horrible things, or the men who are doing horrible things are suffering. It can be both and it's like, which men are doing the horrible things. It's really hard to say, because, and I guess when we think about what is horrible, there's a spectrum, isn't there? So, there's the very severe end, which is kind of like the area in which I sort of focus and work in. But then there's the slightly, and I use my words cautiously, but there's the slightly less severe things that men do. But I guess the impact that those have, the impact that the severe and the less severe actions have on other people isn't necessarily, what am I trying to say? There is still an impact, right? So even somebody who perpetuates the lower, lesser act of stuff is still perpetuating that at a lower level, but probably to a wider range of people. Particularly, if we're talking about, if we're going to name it, it's women. So men who commit the higher acts of violence and aggression and stuff like that against women, they're probably only ever going to do that at a lower rate, because they will probably end up being caught or end up in prison. If you, again, it's not a one rule for all, because obviously there are people who commit multiple murders and all that kind of stuff, and they get away with it for a long time, but eventually they will hopefully get caught. But even they will sort of the number of women that they impact or that they affect will be a smaller number of women. So like the damage that they cause might be greater, and obviously like loss of life and all that kind of stuff, but the amount of people that they do it to will be smaller. Whereas somebody on the lower end of the spectrum might be engaging in sort of the lesser acts of discrimination or sexual violence against women, but they will probably impact more women.
Yeah.
throughout their life. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm going to put that into some words. So it's like the man at the top end who is potentially, and you can correct me if they are guilty of, say, serious sexual assault combined with murder, right? Yeah. They're going to affect a lower number of people, of women, because of the severity of their crimes, and because they're more likely to be caught, right? So the impact is great, but the number they affect isn't as relative. Whereas a man on the smaller end who, let's name a crime, like, I don't know, he might be a man that gropes people on the tube, for instance, right?
Yeah.
That crime is lesser in comparison to the first ones that I mentioned, but he's probably able to do that every day for 25 years. Right?
Exactly.
Or he'd be able to do it every day for 25 years on the tube and then at work and blah, blah, blah. So there would be thousands of women that would be impacted by his actions. Yeah. That's what I got.
Exactly. Yeah. So you've put that into far more succinctly than I did. And so I guess, it's the idea that, so there's that, but then the other side, so then the third part is that, so the first part is that men experience difficulty, hardship, they suffer. The other thing is that men do bad things. And then the other thing that I try and do is I try and think about the accountability part. So I think, I don't know, I straddle a really, this is my view as well. And I've had quite strong conversations with people in my DMs, and I think over time people have gravitated towards my page, and then they've maybe left because actually it might seem quite contradictory in what I do. In my head it makes sense, but maybe when people see particular messages and out of context to just generally who I am, it maybe lands very differently. But I hold all three of those things at the same time, that men can experience suffering, but that also that men as a population can do horrible things, but then also at the same time, men need accountability. And I try and merge all of those things into my account all at the same time, but it doesn't come out at the same time. So sometimes I come out with content that's like, men's mental health needs addressing and thinking about, and this is what we need to do. And then other times I'm like, men do really horrible things and it's, done for this reason. And then I'm like, but then also us as men, we need to try and hold each other accountable. And it's potentially all very confusing. But I guess to answer your question is that I think all three things need to happen. Like, I think as a society, there are some considerations that we need to think about in terms of men. But I also, at the same time, think that they are thought about. I just don't think that they're necessarily labeled as focusing on men. There's so in the sense that so let's try and think about something. I sort of posted something on this on one of your videos earlier today. So the idea that men die younger, which I completely agree with, and I think is an actual relevant thing that obviously needs to be thought about. But there are lots of things that go into trying to address that. So one of the reasons, there's lots of reasons as to why men die younger. So men die younger because they're more likely to be a victim of homicide. They're more likely to die in a car crash because we drive more recklessly, and we're more likely to drive under the influence of alcohol. We engage in more risky behavior. So, we're more likely to, I don't know, do bungee jumping or climb up the side of a cliff, which is going to, if you do that more often, you're probably more likely to die. What else do we do? But then also one of the other things that we struggle with is we struggle to look after ourselves as well as women do. So we don't access healthcare as often as we should. We don't look after our mental health as well as we should. And all of these things contribute to the overall statistic that men die younger. But at the same time, each of those things that I've named, so the fact that men are more likely to be a victim of homicide, that's kind of addressed by the fact that we have police, and there are strategies in place to try and reduce crime, and there are strategies in place to try and, making it illegal to carry around knives, making it pubs closing at an earlier time and not opening for as long, because all the factors relate to arguments, barneys, violence, all that kind of stuff. So there are things that have happened in society and things have been addressed. So and then again, driving campaigns to make sure that people don't drive drunk, or driving campaigns to make sure that people drive slower, and then so whilst and I guess this is the tension that I sit with, in the sense that I fully, yes, see that there are things in society that impact men, but at the same time, I also think about the fact that there are probably things that are trying to help those men, but they're just not necessarily labeled as helping men. Does that make sense? Which I think maybe sometimes lends itself to this idea that society doesn't care about men.
Yeah.
So it's, but then I'm a bit like, but we just don't necessarily label it, because have you heard of the concept of the default man?
I feel like I have, but at this present moment, I can't fully remember it.
So I read a book called Invisible Women by, I can never remember her name. It's like three. Caroline Collado Perez. And she talks about this idea of the default man, where, again, so it kind of links to this whole sort of, notion of the patriarchal society. But the reason why, and I guess it kind of links to what I'm saying, is that society is built around the default man. So I am the default man. You are not the default man, because you have a darker skin tone than I do. So the world is built around me as a default man, but you benefit from that because you are more like me than a woman is, if that makes sense, because you are male and you have a particular way about you, and you think a particular way, and you have, similar physical features, you have big hands, you're tall, all this kind of stuff. So it's the idea that the world is built around a default man, and it's almost that we don't need to name the things that are done for the default man, because they're already done for the default man. Does that make sense? So
yes,
the idea
so it's like the drink driving example. It's as if they changed all the drink driving campaigns to men, stop drink driving. Men, don't drive as fast. Men, go to the hospital when you feel sick. Men, have some friends. Then it would be talking directly to men, but we don't have the man part. We just have the campaign. And that's because of the default man. So the campaign exists because the people that it's aimed at is the default man. So if it was that women were driving more dangerously and were dying more, and actually there is a statistic about the fact that women do die more regularly in car accidents because of the seatbelt configurations and that's all that kind of stuff, there would need to be a campaign that's directly aimed at women, because actually they are not the default man, and they are far from the default man. So they actually need to target a campaign at women, because it's actually the regular campaign sort of doesn't fit for the women, because it's like, well, that doesn't fit for me. So the idea behind the invisibility is that so the idea behind the invisibility is that it's not that men aren't mentioned or men aren't considered, or it's not aimed at men. But the argument of the default man is that it doesn't need to be directly aimed at men, because it is already for men, if that makes sense. It's just not named.
So anything else that is named has to be named, because it needs to be identified that this is not for the default man, or it's not for what is considered the sort of norm. So I guess I sit within this tension of holding in mind that men have difficulties, and that men need support, but also that it exists, and it's just about highlighting what exists, and that it's not that men are being ignored. It's just that there are already these things available. We just need to try and make better use of it, if that makes sense. Yeah, and then on the other hand, like I've said, it's about, in terms of the aggression and the violence, it's about trying to say, this is potentially why men do this. This is some of the reasons behind it. I talk a lot about masculinity because I think underneath everything, and this is just my view, and people might argue differently against it, and I'm always willing to have this conversation, but I think underneath everything, so I talk about beliefs, and I talk about how your beliefs shape what you think about yourself and what you think about others, which then also informs your actions. I think that masculinity, and I'm talking here particularly about, because we're talking about men, I think masculinity is something that isn't thought about enough in terms of shaping, in terms of what men believe about themselves and their place in the world and how they see themselves and how they see the world. And I think those beliefs about manhood and what it means to be a man are so almost second nature and almost sort of in the background, just white noise, that we don't give it a second thought, and we just think that it's about trauma and it's about substance use and it's about all the other things that might go into why men do bad things. But for me, it's always, I try to raise awareness about, it's this thing that kind of sits behind us, beyond us. That's, so you talked about all the history that we have. So you talked about sort of, your experiences as a black man, that you as a black man, you have all this generational stuff behind you. I think men, we have all this masculinity stuff behind us. And I think it shapes our beliefs about the world, which then you pile on trauma, you pile on bad experience, you pile on low self-worth, you pile on all those things, and it's the for me the masculinity ideas about masculinity then shape how we see ourselves, how we see other people, how we then feel that we behave, how we should behave, how we think we're allowed to behave, which then comes into the whole sort of how we treat women and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's go on. I can't quite. I wish I could try to think of a metaphor, but it's almost like this. So if we think about sort of like the body, it's almost like our sort of, the very fine elements of our nervous system that we don't notice, that's very automatic and functions without thinking. I think, which is why I talk a lot about masculinity, is because my point and purpose is to try and say, hey, the reason why men do this, and the reason why we might make these choices, and the reason we might think that we're allowed to behave towards women or trans women, or why white people think that we're allowed. So, why white men think that we're allowed to act towards black men in this way is because from a masculinity perspective, we hold ourselves in a higher status. And it all comes down to, well, I know it's a very simple answer. And again, somebody else might argue differently, but it's just, for me, it's like one of the things that isn't spoken about enough, that almost unconsciously guides a lot of our behavior that we might not necessarily think about.
Yeah, it's that.
So I don't know if I've really answered your question, if I'm honest, David.
Well, I think what I'm taking from that is this, the privileged man and his actions are shaped by the fact that he probably does have some level of trauma. Right? It might not be huge. It might be encased in his masculinity, right? It's almost like you're talking about, there's a level of like masculinity trauma that all men are carrying for generationally, right? That's coming through us from, having fathers who were told to be stoic, or having fathers and grandfathers who come out of war and they weren't allowed to talk about it and stuff like that. And it's just seeping through more and more, or the masculinity that told us 1 or 2 generations back that women's place was this and women were like that and we treat women in that way. Yeah. And that's just being kind of fed to us unconsciously, right? And then you couple that with a low sense of self-worth, some bravado, some low regard for self, coupled with some environmental factors and not feeling like you are, maybe use the opposite of feeling like you don't belong. You receive that you are better than other people, right? And it puts you above them, but you have some of the other stuff as well. Mm-hmm. So coupled with that, and then, as you said, a few misdirections here and there leads to certain actions that are harmful to other people quite easily. Mm-hmm. And I kind of agree with you around masculinity. I think there's this kind of hidden, as you put it, it's like a ghost that we're all just like walking around with, and we just inherit, we don't question how the way of being a man, because that kind of is what we see societally as masculinity, the way of being a man is programmed into us from a young age through everywhere, through everything, through the media, through television, through movies, through our fathers, our grandfathers, the men around us, in the subtle and the not so subtle actions. And that leads us to being certain ways, and questioning it is very difficult because it's so pervasive, because it's like just the way it is. When you start to question it, people get very defensive, right? Because it's personal. People's masculinity is very personal to them.
Absolutely, yeah.
So when you start going, hey, like that behavior you did there, like that's harmful, or whatever name you want to put it, toxic masculinity, whatever name you want to label it, that's my behavior. That's who I am, instead of something I learned and absorbed from somewhere else. And it's that kind of separation that we don't often have as men, because this is who I am as a man, and you're attacking who I am as a man. So I need to defend myself with my spear and sword, or my keyboard, which is more now with my life.
And I think that's one of the things that I'm always key to try and think about, is that I talk about the behavior, and I talk about where the behavior comes from, and I try to avoid saying that individual people are bad. I talk about the behavior and the impact, and then I try and highlight where that behavior comes from. So I try and separate the individual. I talk about the group because it's hard to not talk about the group, but I talk about the group as an identity, or as a sort of construct around the male body, which is then influenced by, like you were saying, the history of masculinity and the development of masculinity, and the sort of social construct that we have around the idea of manhood and stuff. So I try and, as carefully as I can, always make sure that I'm not saying that you as a man are bad, but I do talk about men can do bad things. But I do as best I can try and invite reflection, which is often not always met with the most favorable of responses. But I guess to kind of to try and think about the lens of men, it's about. So the reason why men might do what they do is because they are potentially influenced by the ideas of what it means to be a man. They might have certain ideas of what it means, of what they're allowed to do as a man. It might be around their own personal traumas, which maybe exacerbate the type of things that they might do. But again, that's not necessarily always a reason, because, as I said before, people who have trauma don't always go on to do bad things. So it's interesting to think about, how has the person made sense of the trauma, or have they been able to make sense of the trauma that they've experienced in relation to the actions and behaviors and the harm they cause? Is it about what they're trying to prove within society that relates to this sort of, this dominant apex predatory alpha male type sort of way of conceptualizing manhood? Do all of those things, then it's not just one thing. It's do all of these things kind of then impact on men's behavior, which is so I try and think about it. But then again, like the accountability thing, where I'm like, so this is why we might do it, this is how we might have come about to do it, but then actually let's try think about how we can do things differently. Like, we don't have to be men in this way anymore. We don't have to act in this way anymore. We don't have to, conform to these very rigid stereotype ways of being a man. We can actually do things slightly differently, and we have the choice now to do it. The fact that we're living in a society where there's more breadth of gender expression should really highlight to us that actually the way of being a man that of old, and how maybe some of us have still hold on to it, is actually not the be all and end all. There are multiple ways of being a human being. There are multiple ways of living in this world that are just how somebody feels, and what aligns with their unique sense of self within this place where actually we're both unique, but also not unique, because we're actually all a lot more similar than we care to sometimes admit. I know certainly some people would care to not admit that they're the same as a trans person or a non-binary person or a person that has a darker skin color. So I certainly know that there are people out there who are just like, no, I am me and I am not the same as that. And I was like, well, actually, biologically, historically, evolutionarily, you are very much alike. But yeah. Yeah.
And I think that is a wonderful place to wrap up. I feel like we could talk about many of these things for hours and hours quite easily. And it's been a fantastic conversation to cover such nuanced and difficult topics, actually. We're talking about people who've committed serious crimes, but also understanding, some of the stories, some of the what goes into your work, the positive the unconditional positive regard, the compassion, the empathy, which is actually, in many ways helps rehabilitate them back into society so they can become, productive and functional members of the society. And I imagine that many, many listeners now, after hearing this conversation, would love to, find out more about how you talk about your 3 pillars around men, of what they're doing and accountability for them and so forth. Yeah. Where can people find you?
So I have my Instagram account, which is the Nice-ish Psychologist, but I also have my own podcast, as we mentioned at the very start, which you've been a guest on, David, which is the Nice-ish Ramblings podcast, where I, talk quite a lot about all the stuff I've just mentioned. So if anything I've said has perked your interest, or actually maybe you're a bit confused, or maybe you're a bit angry about anything that I've said, I do invite you to please go and have a listen. And I'm always keen to have, dialogues and discourse and all that kind of stuff. I think, having conversations about these things, everything that we've spoken about, actually, David, from the very beginning up to this point, I think they're important conversations to have. And the more that we can have conversations like this, the more that we can help each other see the similarities that we have as individuals and human beings, and try and, break down these barriers of difference and, otherness, I think would be great. So you can come find me there. I also have a blog thing, which is where most of my podcast stuff is, but it's the Nice-ish Ramblings Substack. So if you Google that, but yeah, that's me.
And I'll put all those links in the show notes so people can find them. I say a big thank you to Dan for tonight. It was such a wonderful conversation, and to learn so much about what you do in a very professional capacity has been really fascinating for me, and also just seeing how much of a crossover it comes down to people's beliefs and their experiences and what's happened to them, and that there's really hope for people. Actually, there's also what I got was a lot of hope. There's if you're listening to this and you see someone in your life and they're going down a bad path, there's hope for them. It doesn't have to be where they end up in life. There is ways to shift and correct their course, or even for yourself, if you're listening to this and you feel like your life isn't going the way you want it to go, maybe not in this kind of serious nature that you would be sitting down with Dan.
Opposite me, yeah. Let's hope nobody listening ends up down that, because that's things have gone very awry then.
But things can shift and change. But yeah, big thank you to Dan for his time this evening. I know we've run over massively, and thank you to you for listening.
Thank you very much, David. It's been a pleasure.
I want to say a big thank you for listening. It's people like yourself that really help get the podcast out into the world. You know, especially if you're often sharing the episodes and the podcast with people that you feel just could do with listening, right? Can see a different way of being a man, maybe a different way of having dating lives and intimacy and relationships. So I want to say a big thank you. And if maybe after listening to this episode, you think, oh, there's someone actually who could really do with this, please share it with them. You know, share the love. I'm really, really grateful. And if, you know, you want to get in contact with me for any questions, or you want to talk about coaching or any working together, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at @theauthenticman_, or you can email me hello@theauthenticman.net. Thank you very much.